The most foolish mistake Vladimir Putin has made since the beginning of this war was believing he could break Ukraine's will through winter. Throughout the past winter, the bloated and decaying machinery of the Kremlin lulled itself into a fantasy that if it fired enough missiles, launched enough drones, shattered the power grid, and pushed millions of Ukrainians into darkness and freezing cold, Kyiv would eventually kneel. Putin believed he had found the key to victory. He was catastrophically wrong. Russia crossed its most dangerous line the moment it struck Kyiv directly, not as military pressure, but as nationwide civilian terror. And in that instant, Moscow effectively signed its own sentence. Ukraine's response was immediate, no concessions, no hesitation, and so brutal that the Kremlin barely understood what had just happened. In just the first weeks of 2026, Russia's air campaign escalated to a near maniacal level. Kamikaze drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, everything was hurled at Ukraine as if Russia's stockpiles were limitless. On January 9th, Russia launched a major strike aimed directly at Ukraine's national power grid. But for Putin, that was still not enough. In the shadowy corridors of power in Moscow, a more ruthless, more reckless, and more idiotic plan took shape to leave Ukraine with no option other than negotiations. As missiles tore through Ukraine's skies, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin's most familiar and shameless mouthpiece, delivered a statement that exposed the regime's diseased mindset. The situation is worsening by the day for the Kyiv authorities. Ukraine's decision-making space is shrinking. The real message was unmistakable and filthy. Negotiate, or Ukrainian civilians will freeze to death in the dark. By January 20th, Russia was no longer merely issuing threats. Moscow unleashed one of the largest, most violent, and most concentrated attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure since the war began. According to the New Voice of Ukraine, this was one of the largest aerial assault campaigns Russia has ever conducted, an act of desperation aimed at breaking the spirit of an entire nation. Moscow poured its most unhinged fury directly onto Kyiv. Ballistic missiles ripped across the sky. The loudest, most violent explosion shook the capital. Fires erupted inside residential neighborhoods. Power and water were cut on the left bank of the Dnipro, the most densely populated part of the city. This was not a precision military strike. It was a destructive ambush aimed squarely at civilian life. The numbers alone expose Russia's desperation. 18 ballistic missiles, 15 cruise missiles, 1 Zircon missile, and 339 attack UAVs. A colossal, extravagant, and wildly expensive storm of fire, the largest Moscow could muster. And yet the result was a humiliating failure. Ukraine's air defenses shattered most of the assault, eliminating the vast majority of missiles and UAVs before they reached their targets. A few did get through, yes, but only a negligible fraction compared to the scale of firepower Russia unleashed. The catastrophic damage the Kremlin hoped for never materialized. Hundreds of millions of dollars in Russian firepower evaporated over Kyiv's skies. That did not soften Ukraine, it did the opposite. Restraint ended, retaliation became only a matter of time, and while the damage from the first strike had not even been fully repaired, Russia continued to expose its own hypocrisy. On January 24th, just hours after Ukrainian, Russian, and US diplomats met in Abu Dhabi to discuss possible de-escalation, Moscow immediately torched any talk of peace with its most familiar response. More missiles, more UAVs. Air raid sirens wailed again. Kyiv shook once more under consecutive explosions. A European diplomat stated bluntly what everyone could already see. Moscow was sending a message written in fire. This is how Vladimir Putin negotiates. Not with agreements, not with goodwill, but with corpses, darkness, and systematic terror. The latest attack only deepened the humanitarian strain on Kyiv. According to Kyiv Post on January 25th, More than 800,000 Kiev residents lost access to stable electricity as Russia continued its attempt to suffocate a city long accustomed to bombardment, but never submission. 6,000 buildings were plunged into darkness. 88,000 households lost power in a single day. This was the direct result of the January 24th strike, an attack with no concealment, no camouflage, and no pretense of military necessity. Ukrainian emergency crews worked through the night, patching the grid block by block, restoring substations one by one, fighting for every hour of heat in the freezing cold. I mean, no one denies a stark reality. The early phase of Russia's winter strategy has caused real material damage. Kremlin missiles and UAVs have cut electricity. Fine, they have disrupted heating on a large scale, but the one thing Putin completely failed to achieve, and will never achieve, is the very objective he craves most: the collapse of Ukrainian will. The only thing Russia has managed to destroy is infrastructure. The only thing it cannot touch is people. And here lies the bitter paradox. Ukraine's Soviet-era legacy, once a chain that bound it, has now become the very vulnerability Moscow is trying to exploit. The BBC has pointed out that Soviet-style urban planning, something Ukraine never chose, has inadvertently made Russia's winter strategy easier to execute. Kiev is filled with apartment blocks dependent on centralized heating systems. Hot water is not generated inside individual buildings. It is produced at centralized plants and then pumped out to sustain thousands of apartments. It is a massive, rigid, and highly vulnerable design. And Russia knows it. Striking heating plants does not require high precision. It does not require defeating armies. It only requires shutting down the heat supply of an entire district. Generators and backup batteries. Yes, they help people endure power outages, but no civilian device can replace a collapsed heating system, especially in winter. This is no longer a technical problem. It is a deliberate psychological attack. For the past 2 weeks, Russia has bombed Kiev and other cities with blatant acts of terror that have produced no tangible military benefit whatsoever. Not a single Ukrainian combat unit has been affected by these strikes. The Ukrainian military is at the front. They are not inside darkened apartments. They are not shivering without heat. The targets are civilians. The ones suffering are not soldiers. They are the most vulnerable, elderly people, the sick, children, those who carry no weapons, who do not go to the front, who are simply trying to survive the winter and the inhuman brutality Russia is inflicting upon them. This is a form of violence that should never exist in the civilized world, and it is being carried out deliberately, day after day, night after night. All so that Vladimir Putin can force Ukraine to the negotiating table and then present maximalist, shameless, and utterly unacceptable demands. Demands he knows Ukraine will not and should never accept. As always, Putin has catastrophically misjudged his opponent, not in terms of weapons, not in terms of air defenses, but in terms of people. Valentina Verdeletska, a deputy director interviewed by The Guardian on January 13th, stated plainly what the Kremlin will never understand. "I think the Russians want to break us. There is no other way, so we must get through these problems. They want to make Ukrainians angry and unhappy. They think that will push us into the streets to protest, but that will not happen." Putin should have listened. Not only to Verdeletska, but much earlier. In September, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky issued a warning that was neither vague, nor diplomatic, nor ambiguous when Kyiv accurately predicted Russia's escalation against the power grid. If they threaten to cut power to Ukraine's capital, then the Kremlin should know there will be power outages in Russia's capital as well. Zelensky did not stop there. He spelled out the logic Moscow has always tried to ignore. Civilized nations differ from barbaric ones in that they never strike first and are not the aggressor, but that does not mean they are weak. Putin did not take that warning seriously, perhaps out of overconfidence, or worse, out of total desensitization to suffering, not only Ukraine's, but even that of his own people. Like just one day after the latest strike, Moscow began to realize how strong Ukraine truly is, and how devastating its retaliation could be. A lesson learned too late and at an enormous cost. But instead of stopping, Putin did what he always does, issued more orders, escalated further, and pushed everything far beyond safe limits. By January 20th, the Kremlin had not only intensified its rhetoric, but officially elevated its actions to a far more dangerous level. Russia directly targeted substations linked to nuclear safety. Reuters confirmed this detail, exposing a chilling truth. Moscow crossed its final threshold. No more pretending to avoid escalation. No more concern for catastrophic risk. The Kremlin is willing to gamble with nuclear safety on Ukraine's streets. On the night of January 20th, Russia launched a missile and UAV strike worth an estimated $131 million, a staggering, ostentatious, and reckless figure that clearly reflects Moscow's loss of strategic control. With Russia's budget deficit reaching $70 billion, burning more than $130 million in a single night was not a military decision. It was economic self-destruction. Putin is not only attacking Ukraine, he is bleeding his own people dry. And just one day after the January 24th strike, Ukraine responded immediately, fast, precise, without hesitation. Kyiv's counterstrike was not a warning, it was action. The target, Belgorod. This was not a random choice. Belgorod is Russia's closest logistics hub to the border, the launch platform for Moscow's ground and air assaults since the so-called special military operation began. In February 2022, here Putin and his inner circle at the Kremlin were convinced of one thing: Belgorod was absolutely safe. Ukraine would never be able to strike back. War would never touch Russian soil. At the time, they did not care that Belgorod housed power plants, critical military facilities, and hundreds of thousands of civilians. In the Kremlin's arrogant logic, Ukraine would collapse before it could retaliate. War, they believed, was a one-way affair. 4 years later, that entire illusion has shattered. On January 25th, Ukraine placed a definitive exclamation point on Putin's foolish arrogance with an airstrike that Belgorod authorities themselves were forced to acknowledge as the largest the region and the city bearing its name had suffered throughout the war. Belgorod was no longer a rear area, no longer immune, no longer a place where war would never arrive. At least 50 explosions tore through Belgorod in a single night. Power went out, water ran dry, but heat vanished. According to Kiev Post, this was a direct eye-for-an-eye response. Ukraine striking back at the very instrument Russia had used to terrorize Kiev: energy. This time, Kiev did not scatter blows. It struck straight at the heart. The central target of the strike was the Belgorod Thermal Power Plant, TPP, one of the most critical energy facilities in the region. Militarny confirmed that the plant on Pinvishno-Donetska Street was hit by multiple consecutive strikes, with the munitions most likely launched from HIMARS systems. Russian air defenses proved completely helpless. No interception, no prevention, no recovery. The Belgorod TPP became the night's most prominent victim, and not by accident. This was a target of unmistakable strategic value. The plant is responsible for supplying heat to central and northern districts of Belgorod, accounting for more than 36% of the city's total heating demand. The result was that approximately 115,000 people were pushed directly toward the risk of losing heat in the middle of winter. Concrete fragments, metal debris, and thermal infrastructure components fell directly onto the heating facility, exactly following the logic Zelensky had warned about back in September. No need to strike Russia's capital, just shut off the heat where they believed they were safe. Russia typically tries to downplay, conceal, or distort the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes. This time, it could not. Reality spread faster than propaganda. Russian Telegram channels, including Astra, a Ukraine-leaning outlet, were flooded with on-site videos. Fire, darkness, paralyzed residential districts. One night was enough to shatter the illusion that only Russia possessed dangerous long-range weapons. In a post sharing multiple clips, Astra wrote bluntly, "Additional strikes have targeted the Belgorod thermal power plant. Some areas have lost electricity, not only power, but also water supply. Monitoring channels report this as one of the strongest attacks." Belgorod understood the message. Putin did as well. Facts quickly overtook initial denials. Just hours later, Vyacheslav Gladkov was forced to contradict his own earlier statements, admitting that the damage was far more severe than he had initially tried to minimize. Homes, vehicles, infrastructure, all were hit. And more importantly, Ukraine did not limit its strikes to the Belgorod TPP alone. The attacks expanded in a controlled manner, reaching multiple areas across Belgorod Oblast, Borisov, Valuysky, Volokhonovsky, Graivoron, and Krasnoyarsk, triggering gas supply disruptions in several residential zones. That detail alone is enough to confirm one thing. Ukraine hit exactly what it intended to hit. Not randomly, not indiscriminately, not out of control. Areas lost gas not because of chaos, but because the Belgorod TPP was burning, precisely at the choke point of the heating and energy supply system. This strike was designed to paralyze, not to kill. Some may have assumed Ukraine would wait for a more symbolic moment to strike Putin. That retaliation would be saved for a more emotionally charged occasion. Kyiv chose strategic timing, not emotional timing. Ukraine did not need to issue statements. It let firepower speak. To this day, Kyiv has released no official comment on the January 25th Belgorod strike, likely because there was nothing to explain. If Russia proved on January 24th that peace talks were a farce, Ukraine proved the opposite. Peace can only exist when the aggressor is forced to stop. The one fact that is nearly certain, and that even Moscow cannot conceal, is that Ukraine used HIMARS in this strike. Russian sources themselves confirmed it, and no serious observer of this war was surprised. Belgorod is a border region, and it sits well within range, especially if Ukraine employed HIMARS Block 1A, a missile variant with a range of up to 186 miles, approximately 300 kilometers, sufficient to cover all critical targets across the region. Each missile carries hundreds of submunitions, allowing precise strikes against large facilities without indiscriminate destruction. And HIMARS is not the final limit. The system is also capable of launching ATACMS, a weapon Moscow understands all too well. And from the moment Belgorod ceased to be a safe zone,
January 28, 2026. Crimea was once Vladimir Putin's favorite showcase of power. That arrogance is now collapsing. The peninsula has become a center of instability, shortages, and logistical siege for more than 2 million people. The latest and most alarming proof of this shift came when the Kerch Bridge, through which 12,000 logistics vehicles pass every day, was forced to shut down. And the ones who put up the roadblock signs were Ukraine's intelligence services. Specifically at 3:11 p.m., a mission that appeared routine began. A Ukrainian PD-2 reconnaissance UAV was orbiting above the Kerch Bridge at an altitude of 10,990 feet, a perfect blind spot. Below, a Russian military convoy crept forward at just 9.3 miles per hour, towing 152mm artillery and carrying logistics supplies valued at nearly $190 million. An easy target, right? Except Ukraine's drone was no longer the hunter. It was being hunted. Every time the UAV transmitted live video back to the control bunker, it emitted a radio signal, a clear footprint across the electromagnetic spectrum. And the Russians had something listening. The Zupark-1 counter-battery radar system, originally designed to trace artillery trajectories, was now being repurposed to detect UAV signal sources. By collecting signal bearings from multiple locations, Russian forces could pinpoint the operator's position. Minutes later, artillery would rain down on that spot. Grim battlefield statistics make it clear. Maintaining a continuous transmission for more than 5 minutes means a 50% chance of never seeing your family again. The Ukrainian UAV team understood this well, so they changed their approach. Control signals frequency hopped across 121 internal channels every 3 seconds, transmitting data only in ultra-short bursts, 0.3 seconds, then complete silence for 30 seconds, repeating the cycle. Enough to retain control, but not enough to be fixed in place. The situation worsened when thermal sensors detected a Russian Orlan 10 UAV approaching from the east. That meant the enemy suspected a nearby control team and had released its own hunter. Orlan 10 is not just a reconnaissance drone. Its thermal camera can detect human body heat at distances up to 1.8 miles. For the Ukrainian operators, the choice was stark: continue tracking the target and be exposed, or dive under thermal blankets and accept blindness. They chose concealment. But before vanishing from the thermal spectrum, they had to warn an FPV team waiting 3.6 miles away. Direct radio communication was the standard option, and also suicide. Two attack teams transmitting simultaneously would create an electromagnetic spike large enough for Russia to triangulate both positions. Instead, the PD-2 dropped a digital footprint, a tiny encrypted data packet transmitted on 433 MHz, a band Russia does not prioritize for UAV control monitoring. Just 0.3 seconds, too short to locate, too difficult to decode. Inside was everything the strike team needed to incinerate the Russian convoy: GPS coordinates, convoy speed, wind conditions, and the optimal attack vector. 5 Ukrainian FPV drones, already powered up, captured nearly the entire data packet. 8-inch carbon fiber frames, 5.5-pound shaped charge warheads, 20-volt batteries, enough for roughly 10 minutes of flight. The first 1.8 miles passed smoothly. The drones flew low at just 6.5 feet, hugging the tree line. 1080p video at 60 frames per second. Then exactly at the 1.8 mile mark, the video began to fracture. Interference crushed the control signal. Frame rate dropped to 30, then 15. Russia's Repellent 1 jamming system had been activated, pumping 600 watts of electromagnetic chaos into the surrounding airspace. The operator switched to the backup 433 MHz channel. Some signal returned, blurred, delayed, but usable. Yet at 0.9 miles, even the backup channel weakened. Russia was not using a single jammer but multiple layers, mounted on vehicles, in trenches, and possibly from a rear area system. An electronic black hole was forming, consuming the drone's lifeline. With control links almost entirely severed, the Ukrainian FPV switched to semi-autonomous mode. Its AI module, trained on tens of thousands of hours of combat footage, needed just 2 seconds of clear imagery within 1,968 feet to lock onto a target. But to reach that distance, the drone had to fly blind through the jamming zone. The operator switched to estimated navigation, heading 80 degrees, altitude raised to 9.8 feet, speed reduced to 27 miles per hour to conserve battery. A fleeting frame suddenly flashed. The truck was exactly where calculated, in the central span of the bridge. Immediately after, a Russian interceptor UAV dove in from an altitude of 20 meters. An aerial dogfight unfolded in seconds. The Ukrainian FPV, heavier due to its warhead, was less agile. Battery drain accelerated. The Russian pilot held the advantage in altitude and energy. In 18 seconds of engagement, the Ukrainian FPV lost nearly 30% of its battery just evading attacks. But with a sudden freefall followed by a vertical reversal, the Ukrainian operator escaped the final interception attempt and drove straight toward the bridge. At a distance of less than 164 feet, the most traditional defense appeared: infantry with small arms and shotguns, 5.45 millimeter rounds, buckshot, but all of it was meaningless. Exactly at 3:23 p.m., the UAV swarm accelerated sharply, fast enough for 5 HE warheads to penetrate the ammunition load. 2,152 millimeter artillery shells detonated almost simultaneously. The bridge could not withstand the pressure. Trucks, artillery pieces, and sections of the bridge collapsed into the river. From above, the PD-2 captured everything, the smoke column rising hundreds of meters into the air, and the logistical choke point disappearing entirely. Crimea shuddered as attack struck the Kerch Bridge, the peninsula's only direct land link to Russia, forcing a complete shutdown. This was not an ordinary traffic disruption. The Kerch Bridge is Crimea's lifeline. Blocking it threatens the entire system, from healthcare and transportation to the supply chain for essential goods. The danger had been seeded earlier, rooted in panic-driven decisions by the Kremlin. On December 26, 2025, Russia rushed to deploy 212 additional checkpoints on routes leading to the Kerch Bridge, aiming to inspect up to 38,000 vehicles per day. The result was paralysis, hours-long truck queues. Combined with the full bridge closure on January 28th, a severe logistical bottleneck formed. Long lines of buses at Nemov Square reflected more than civilian delays. They were the image of a community with no exit, and that was only the surface. The blockade threatened to slow the entire transport chain, pushing Crimea's market into an extremely fragile state, where even a short, prolonged disruption could trigger hoarding psychology and place food security on high alert, especially as ferry capacity is insufficient and winter conditions turn the peninsula's self-sufficiency into a serious strategic question. The risk became most acute as this bottleneck overlapped Crimea's existing crises, fuel and water. Throughout 2025, Ukraine's systematic strikes on Russian refineries and fuel depots drove the peninsula into severe shortages. By September 2025, authorities were forced to freeze gasoline and diesel prices and impose a 7.9 gallon per driver fuel limit. Images of residents siphoning fuel from neighbors' cars ceased to be exceptions and became social alarm signals. The sudden, prolonged closure of the Kerch Bridge only increased both the frequency and desperation of such acts. Kremlin propaganda portraying a normal and stable Crimea began to collapse under the reality of lines at gas stations. I-95 gasoline and diesel ran dry across multiple districts. In major cities like Simferopol, fuel was sold only by vouchers or cards, while black market prices surged to 90 rubles per liter. Local chat groups filled with drivers' desperate questions about the next supply. When a peninsula depends almost entirely on road transport and that route is repeatedly targeted, the space ceases to be a sustainable living area and becomes economically and socially isolated. The water crisis was even more dangerous. After the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed, northern Crimea fell into prolonged drought, pushing agriculture to the brink of collapse. As reservoir levels dropped to critical thresholds, water tankers, filtration equipment, or relief supplies trapped at the Kerch Bridge risked turning civil stress into a humanitarian disaster. In tourist areas like Alushta, countdown clocks appeared. Only 85 to 90 days of water remained. In Sevastopol and Simferopol, taps ran just a few hours per day. Residents worried not only about fuel, but about daily access to clean water. From a military perspective, the picture was even darker. More than 60,000 Russian troops stationed in Crimea face similar shortages. Each soldier requires an average of 21 to 26 gallons of water per day for drinking, hygiene, cooking, and equipment cooling. At many bases, actual availability fell to just 5 to 8 gallons per day, prioritized for command centers. A unit of 1,000 troops effectively received enough water for only a few dozen. At the same time, supply routes from Crimea to the southern front, especially Zaporizhia and Kherson, depended heavily on the Kerch Bridge. When trains stop and trucks are stuck, frontline artillery falls silent, tanks stand immobilized for lack of fuel, and even a 7-hour disruption can translate into days of ammunition shortages at the front. The Kerch Bridge closure was not an isolated incident, but the outcome of a multi-layered operation, tightly coordinated by Ukraine's defense forces. Russia's Ministry of Defense attempted to downplay the situation, claiming more than 10 UAVs were shot down. Field data and satellite imagery, however, showed far greater severity. In the early hours of January 28th, Russian occupation authorities immediately sealed the Crimea Bridge after receiving intelligence warnings of a large-scale airstrike. Russian air defenses proved insufficient as simultaneous explosions were recorded across the peninsula. The strike's focal points were the strategic air bases Belbek, Saki, and Kacha. At 7:39 a.m. Kyiv time, two powerful explosions rocked Belbek near Sevastopol, where Russia deploys Su-27 and Su-30 fighters to defend Crimea's airspace. Saki, already battered by previous strikes, was hit again, while explosions were also reported near Cape Tarkankut, home to long-range radar and electronic warfare systems. Kacha Airfield, a base for helicopters and maritime patrol aircraft of the Black Sea Fleet, was struck around midnight. This synchronized sequence showed Ukraine applying saturation tactics, overwhelming Russian air defenses and opening corridors for primary strikes. The decision to shut down the Kerch Bridge, one of the most heavily protected structures in the world, reflected panic-driven orders from the Russian side. Halt all traffic because real threats could no longer be distinguished from decoys. Technical analyses indicate that a combination of Ukrainian domestic UAVs and Western-supported long-range weapons neutralized Russia's traditional protective measures. From the truck bomb in 2022 to naval UAV attacks in 2023 to the aerial campaign of early 2026, Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated adaptation and innovation in striking this symbolic structure. The Kerch Bridge is not just infrastructure. It is the political symbol of the claim that Crimea is forever Russian. Every closure, every air raid warning erodes the image of an impregnable fortress. Extreme security measures, such as the 212 checkpoints, have instead turned the bridge into a strategic choke point, negating its very purpose. In trying to hold Crimea by military force, Russia is losing administrative control, economic stability, and social trust. Territory can be seized with tanks, but it cannot be governed without fuel, water, and basic stability. The consequences extend internationally. Russia's need to appeal to Belarus for fuel after the crisis signals a shifting balance of power. Moscow's partners are beginning to question the defensive capacity of a power that cannot secure its own strategic logistics line. NATO is closely monitoring the situation as Russia's logistical weakness severely undermines its military deterrence. Crimea, once portrayed as a fortress, is becoming a strategic liability, forcing Russia to choose between pouring resources into a logistical trap or gradually withdrawing from the peninsula.
Putin is worried. He has just been cornered, if not pushed into a situation that is no longer salvageable, but not because of defeat on the battlefield. He was struck directly at his lifeline, and that blow came from France. Not a single shot was fired, not one missile was launched. Yet overnight, Paris became Vladimir Putin's most immediate headache, far beyond anything the Kremlin had anticipated. The war in Ukraine has bogged down disastrously. The West has turned away almost completely, and time is no longer on the side of a leader too old to wait for Ukraine to collapse. What Putin never foresaw was France stepping in directly, cold, precise, and with enough force to shake Russia's entire survival network. And France did not strike just once. It delivered 2 consecutive blows. The second will open the door for Ukraine to do what it needs most. But first, the opening strike hit straight into Russia's hidden oil artery. On January 22nd, BBC News reported that France had taken control of a Russian Shadow Fleet oil tanker while it was transiting the Mediterranean. No noise, no warning, but lethal. The vessel, named Grinch, a name almost perfectly ironic, was seized for violating international sanctions and sailing under a false flag, as directly confirmed by Emmanuel Macron. The moment the French Navy closed in, the crew likely understood Christmas had been stolen. The operation was swift, followed by a comprehensive inspection. And the conclusion left no room for denial. The flag was invalid. Put plainly, a Russian vessel was masquerading under another nationality. This is the classic method of Russia's shadow fleet, changing flags, names, and paperwork to evade sanctions, deceive monitoring systems, and keep oil money flowing into the war. This time, France caught it red-handed. In the immediate aftermath, Macron did not hedge. He publicly sent a message aimed straight at the Kremlin. We will not tolerate any violations. He stressed that the operation was conducted in international waters in the Mediterranean, in coordination with allies, and in strict compliance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. No gray zone, no legal loopholes, no escape for Russia. This was not a random inspection. It was a deliberate strike against the illegal oil transport system that keeps Putin's war machine alive. And this was only the first blow. A judicial investigation has been opened. The vessel has been diverted. That brief statement from Emmanuel Macron confirmed the most important point. France did not just stop the ship, it locked it inside a legal vice. And his reference to allies revealed something much larger. Paris did not act alone on the night of January 22nd. That ally was the United Kingdom. According to LBC, a Royal Navy patrol vessel had been tracking the Russian Shadow Fleet tanker long before French forces moved in. John Healey confirmed that London provided tracking support as the ship passed through the Strait of Gibraltar. That makes perfect sense. Gibraltar is the maritime choke point between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Narrow, unavoidable, and heavily monitored. The UK maintains a base there. Cell BC reported that HMS Dagger was deployed, most likely from that base, to shadow the target as it slipped quietly into the Mediterranean. The Grinch sailed under the flag of Comoros, an East African nation few could point out on a map, and continued its voyage until France intercepted it, but the disguise changed nothing. Grinch was already a known target, sanctioned by the UK, the European Union, and the United States, all accusing it of belonging to Russia's shadow fleet and keeping oil revenues flowing despite bans. Subsequent investigations revealed the vessel had departed from Russia's Murmansk region. Its final destination was not disclosed, and that very ambiguity only strengthened the case. This was not the first time London had intervened in such operations in recent weeks. In early January, the United States targeted 2 additional vessels, one in the Caribbean and one in the Atlantic, suspected of transporting oil between Russia and Venezuela. One of them, now named Marinera, formerly Bella 1, forced U.S. forces into a pursuit spanning hundreds of miles at sea after initially attempting to evade capture. The picture is becoming unmistakably clear. The net is tightening, strait by strait, route by route, ship by ship, and there are fewer and fewer places left to hide. The hunt for Russia's shadow fleet tankers did not stop with Grinch. US authorities have since intercepted another vessel between Scotland and Iceland, where it was found flying the flag of Guyana, one of the camouflage flags commonly used to evade international scrutiny. In that case, the United Kingdom once again played a critical role by providing what Sky News described as necessary support. Britain not only allowed the US to use its bases, but also deployed the replenishment tanker RFA Tide Force to assist the pursuit. At least one Royal Air Force aircraft also joined the operation, providing aerial surveillance to ensure the target was tracked correctly. France may have dominated global headlines on January 22nd with the interception of Grinch, but the full sequence of events reveals something far larger, an unprecedented coordinated Western campaign to choke off oil flows, the critical revenue stream Putin is using to sustain his war. Tankers of this type are the economic linchpin of Russia's sanctions evasion strategy. The West refers to them as the Shadow Fleet, a network of aging, loosely regulated vessels that use false flags and falsified identifiers to bypass sanctions and keep Russian oil moving to market. The Guardian and other specialist analyses note that this fleet consists of hundreds of large tankers, many of which have already been sanctioned by the United States, the United Kingdom, or the European Union. According to analysis by Lloyd's List Intelligence, the Shadow Fleet currently numbers around 1,423 vessels, of which 921 are listed under sanctions. This is the largest dark network Moscow has assembled to transport oil without which Putin's war machine would lose one of its most significant economic drivers since the conflict began. And what we are now seeing is this. Western countries are not merely issuing paper bans. They are cooperating closely, using military assets and legal mechanisms to intercept, track, and dismantle targets. Russian vessels cannot hide indefinitely behind false flags or carefully chosen sea routes. Putin once believed he could evade sanctions, conceal ownership, and ship oil without limits. Plus, now the very network he built to finance the war is being dismantled piece by piece, under the legal scrutiny and operational pressure of the West. The figures associated with Russia's shadow fleet are likely still underestimates. No one knows exactly how many vessels Moscow truly controls, and that very opacity is what makes the system both dangerous and fragile. In this context, France's seizure of a single tanker is not a punch powerful enough to knock Russia out immediately. That ship will never sail again. Yes, but others can be substituted. There is a reason Putin had invested at least $14 billion into this fleet by May 2025, according to Ukrainian shipping magazine. This is not a side operation. It is a deliberately constructed sanctions evasion machine. But the real significance is not the Grinch itself, it is the message. France sent an unmistakable signal: we are watching, and Paris is not alone. The UK and the United States have sharply increased pressure in recent weeks, proactively intercepting, tracking, and dismantling Shadow Fleet operations wherever possible. A network that once operated largely beyond the reach of law is now being illuminated voyage by voyage. Surveillance creates risk, and risk is something this system cannot tolerate. Putin will continue to send ships to sea. He has no choice. Oil remains a vital source of revenue, even when Russia is forced to sell it at humiliating discounts. With a large budget deficit, near zero access to international credit, and frozen foreign reserves, Moscow needs every dollar it can squeeze out, and oil is the largest artery left. But from this moment on, Putin knows one thing very clearly: they can see him. Every vessel leaving Russia's coastline now carries the risk of seizure, especially if it dares enter European or US waters. There are no more gray zones, no more slipping through unnoticed. The logic is simple. Today France seized one ship. Tomorrow France, very likely with allies, can seize more. And if a coordinated, systematic campaign is activated to dismantle the Shadow Fleet at scale, Putin has no legitimate countermeasure. The entire structure of this fleet is built on denial. Denial of ownership, denial of mission, denial of purpose. Once seized, Russia cannot step forward to claim the vessel, and that is the lethal trap Putin built for himself. Europe does not only have the will, it has the full legal arsenal to turn the seizure of Russian tankers into routine practice. This is not speculation. The European Policy Center has been explicit. The legal framework is already in place. From the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which allows states to intervene against shipping deemed unsafe in their waters, to MARPOL and SOLAS, which permit the detention of vessels that fail safety standards. Put the pieces together, and the picture is simple. Russia has no legal footing to cling to, even if it attempts to reclaim seized ships. In other words, seizure is no longer an exception, it can become a process. But all of this, important as it is, still does not constitute the most decisive blow, because the shock that truly rattled Moscow did not occur at sea. France's second strike against Russia had already been fired earlier, while seizing a ghost fleet tanker is always headline-worthy, especially for Ukraine in a war of attrition where victory depends on financially and militarily bleeding Russia. The next revelation was the real killing blow. France has surpassed the United States to become Ukraine's largest provider of military intelligence. On January 16th, less than a week before the Grinch incident, Business Insider reported that Emmanuel Macron warned Russia by publicly revealing a figure the Kremlin could not ignore. That figure was 2/3. In his New Year address to the French armed forces, Macron stated plainly, 1 year ago, Ukraine depended heavily on US intelligence capabilities. Today, 2/3 are provided by France. 2/3. The significance of that statement goes far beyond a statistic. It shows that Ukraine is gradually detaching itself from absolute dependence on Washington, especially at a time when no one can be certain how much intelligence the US is providing to Kyiv, and that shift alters the balance in ways Moscow cannot control. Stay with this to the end, because this is the real layer of power shaping Ukraine's trajectory. France's rise as a primary intelligence partner is not accidental. Business Insider notes that this aligns perfectly with Paris's ambition to become a regional military pillar in Europe, precisely as the Trump administration pushes the continent to assume greater responsibility for its own defense. Put bluntly, France is filling the gap. In its analysis of Macron's remarks, the Kyiv Independent emphasized why intelligence, regardless of its source, is a vital asset for Ukraine. Every fragment of data has battlefield value, especially high-resolution, frequently updated satellite imagery. Information that can map Russian deployments, mark critical targets, and open pathways for long-range missile and UAV strikes. Think of this intelligence layer as eyes in orbit, directly augmenting reconnaissance UAVs that scan the ground 24/7. When these two layers overlap, the targeting picture becomes complete, from detection to confirmation to fire guidance. We do not have a detailed inventory of exactly what France is providing, but the clues are unmistakable. One of them came from Sébastien Lecornu in March 2025, speaking on France Inter. Lecornu stated plainly that France was willing and able to share whatever intelligence Ukraine needed. He emphasized the decisive nature of that data. Our intelligence is independent, built on our own capabilities, and we are sharing it with the Ukrainians. There were no technical specifics, no list of platforms, but the phrase sovereign intelligence alone led Militarny to a logical conclusion. France is most likely providing data through its military optical satellite constellation, Composante Spatiale Optique, CSO. CSO is not a political symbol. It is an operational capability designed to observe, update, and confirm targets at the tempo of the battlefield. And because this source is independent of the United States, it reduces the risk of disruption, increases continuity, and gives Kiev far greater autonomy in choosing timing and targets. This was France's second strike, not as visible as seizing a tanker, but deeper and heavier. The full deployment of CSO was completed in 2025. Oh, and one backstage detail speaks volumes. The final satellite in the 3-satellite constellation was transported to the launch site aboard a Ukrainian Antonov in 124. This was not accidental. It was a signal of a partnership forged long before anyone publicly acknowledged its depth. Militarny describes the constellation's structure with clarity. All 3 satellites share an identical design. Their optical system is based on a coarse telescope configuration, with mirrors made of ultra-stable zero-dur glass ceramic, whose thermal expansion coefficient is near 0, meaning accuracy is not distorted by temperature changes. The satellites are also equipped with infrared imaging channels, expanding observation capability across multiple conditions. Each satellite carries multiple telescopes, others allowing the same target to be imaged from several angles. That capability alone enables the creation of 3D terrain models, an invaluable advantage for Ukraine in planning, fire guidance, and damage assessment. And that is only part of why Kiev chose deep cooperation with Paris. The strength lies not only in individual satellites, but in the overall architecture. CSO was designed to collect intelligence as a system, where each satellite has a distinct role, operating in parallel to fuse data, reduce latency, and sharpen the battlefield picture. CSO-1 operates at the highest orbit, approximately 497 miles, approximately 800 kilometers, serving as the high-level strategic reconnaissance layer. It provides imagery with resolution down to 13.7 inches per pixel, sufficient to identify armored vehicles, Russian aircraft, and large deployment clusters. CSO-2 flies lower at around 298 miles, approximately 480 kilometers, delivering imagery with 7 inches per pixel resolution. This altitude fundamentally changes identification quality, not merely seeing a tank, but distinguishing the specific type and configuration present on the ground. CSO-2 does not merely see, as it discriminates. The satellite can identify decoy targets, ensuring Ukraine does not waste munitions on harmless mock-ups. That difference separates strikes on vital arteries from money thrown out the window. Then comes CSO-3. In orbital altitude and sharpness, it is nearly a twin of CSO-1, but its role is entirely different. CSO-3 increases revisit frequency, shortening the time between image updates. A simple concept, but lethally effective. Ukraine can also draw on commercial imagery layers from the Pleiades and Pleiades Neo constellations operated by Airbus Defence and Space between 2011 and 2021. The partnership is not distant. Ukraine was involved in the deployment chain, making assumptions about access entirely reasonable. Take a breath, because this is the strategic core. The greatest value of French intelligence for Ukraine is not just resolution, but independence. Kiev can never be certain that Washington will always provide what is needed, on time, and at sufficient depth. What 2025 made unmistakably clear is that US-Ukraine relations can pivot in an instant, often tied to negotiations with Russia. On March 5th, 2025, Mike Waltz confirmed that the United States had temporarily suspended military intelligence sharing with Ukraine following the disastrous White House meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. That moment explains why Paris became indispensable, an independent, continuous intelligence pillar not subject to political winds across the Atlantic. Putin understands one thing very clearly: Paris is far harder to manipulate than Washington ever was. Emmanuel Macron is not a partner easily drawn into transactional bargaining of that kind. Of course, France has limits to its intelligence capacity, and Ukraine would still prefer the United States to remain engaged. But with 2/3 of intelligence now coming from France, Kyiv no longer faces the risk of abandonment every time political winds shift in Washington. Battlefield effects followed immediately. While absolute confirmation is impossible, it is highly likely that Ukraine relied on French intelligence for a 48-hour strike campaign that tore open the skies over occupied territories, dismantling multiple Russian air defense systems and radar sites. When independent, continuous intelligence is assured, the tempo accelerates and Russia's seams begin to show. What Moscow now confronts is not just bombs and missiles, but a new intelligence structure, less dependent on the United States, harder to pressure, and no longer trapped by political ultimatums. For centuries, Russian armies won wars with the weather on their side, a natural shield that broke an enemy's will before the first shot was fired. They called it General Winter, but in Ukraine, that rule has inverted. Russia is no longer hunkering down in defense. It is advancing, and when you are the one pushing forward, winter no longer protects, it strikes back. What is unfolding around Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad makes this unmistakably clear. Key positions north of both cities remain in Ukrainian hands, despite Moscow's repeated claims of capture. The decisive factor is no longer artillery or UAVs, it is weather as an expanding cost. Winter hits both sides, but in opposite ways. Ukraine adjusts its tempo like a driver easing off the throttle on icy roads. The Kremlin, by contrast, keeps flooring the gas with an engine already freezing solid. With no tactical adaptation and no minimum guarantees of survival, Russian soldiers are left in frozen trenches, as if history itself would automatically pick up the bill. Operational data and intelligence assessments released by Ukraine show a clear degradation of Russia's offensive momentum, as the cold exposes a deeper problem: systematic disregard for troop welfare. The consequences extend beyond manpower. Russian vehicles, supply routes, and logistics freeze in the literal sense, turning the push toward the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad axis into a vehicle stalled in winter, quiet, but with every passing minute adding to the cost. Polevy highlights a contrast that is existential. For Ukraine, General Winter is doing exactly what it once did for Russia. Ukrainian units are defending in proper posture, reinforced positions, wind-sheltered cover, sufficiently deep stockpiles, functioning heating. As a result, they hold through the Donetsk cold, with the BBC recording pre-dawn temperatures on January 27 dropping to 6.8 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately minus 14 degrees Celsius. Ukraine treats winter as a strategic variable. Russia charges into it like a trap. Around Pokrovsk, that trap is slowly closing. The difference is not about who endures cold better, but about posture. Ukraine is defending, Russia is attacking. In winter, that line is life and death. Polevy describes the stark reality of Russian assault units. Without mechanized resupply, everything is crammed into a backpack, a thin ground mat, a lightweight sleeping bag, a blanket, and, if lucky, a small gas stove. No fortifications, no heated shelters, no sustaining logistics. That is how one enters winter without insurance. Under such conditions, cold is no longer an environment, it becomes a disaster multiplier. Open terrain, inadequate wind winter gear, and, most critically, no plan for long-term survival. Frozen ground locks out digging. Wind and snow drain the body's batteries within hours. Any attempt at heating becomes the equivalent of switching on headlights in a dark parking lot. A small flame, the only thing keeping a soldier from freezing to death, lights up on Ukrainian UAV thermal cameras like a neon sign. On a battlefield saturated with FPV drones and reconnaissance UAVs, heat is not salvation, it is a coordinate. Russian soldiers are forced into a brutal choice: freeze slowly or be detected and eliminated. There is no third turnoff. The consequences arrive in winter's familiar forms: frostbite, hypothermia, loss of sensation in hands and feet, movement slows, reactions dull. When H hour arrives, the infantry storms Moscow, expects collapse into fragmented stop-start assaults that are easily contained. Frozen soldiers mean a frozen front, a quiet process, but one that charges Russia more with every passing hour. Putin continues to order advances, regardless of weather, regardless of terrain. The only metric he appears to see is not how many soldiers are freezing in the icebound trenches around Pokrovsk, but whether an assault crawls forward a few hundred more meters. That obsession has turned winter from a historical ally into Russia's direct enemy. The battlefield responds quickly. Offensives once sketched as waves deflate into trickling collisions that produce no meaningful breakthrough. Ukraine does not need to mount a major counteroffensive. It holds its positions and lets the weather do the rest, like standing still at the top of an icy slope while the opponent slips and falls on their own. The core difference is posture. Ukraine entered winter prepared. Russia entered winter carrying historical illusion. Around Pokrovsk, that illusion is melting like ice set beside a heater, slow, cold, and irreversible. When assault axes are broken by frost before they even leave the line of departure, the effects go beyond failure to advance. They sink deeper. Men collapse before combat begins. According to Army Inform, January 23rd, the degree of disregard for life on the Pokrovsk axis is so severe that Ukrainian forces openly describe Russian units as single-use soldiers, not to seize ground, but to burn themselves out like feeding wet wood into a fire just to keep it from going out. Volodymyr Cherniak, an officer with the Rubish Brigade of Ukraine's National Guard, describes a grim reality. Many Russian soldiers are driven forward under threat of punishment, and in winter, the clock does not favor the wounded. It favors the cold, like leaving a broken vehicle outside in sub-zero temperatures, where every passing minute raises the cost of repair. This picture is not new. Months ago, the Center for European Policy Analysis warned that within the Russian military, evacuation and treatment are not tactical priorities. A Russian combat medic once admitted on Telegram that soldiers receive no basic first aid training. On a winter battlefield, that translates into a brutal rule. Wounds that should have been survivable become unpaid debts, and the cold is the collector. A shocking finding by Verstka, based on Russia's own internal medical studies, shows that more than 5% of soldiers classified as salvageable died in Ukraine solely because they were not evacuated or treated in time. As winter closes in on Donetsk, that figure does not cool off. It rises quietly, like a massacre without firepower, requiring only time and cold. In this context, the cold becomes an invisible killer. Snow, wind, mud, and deep sub-zero temperatures choke mobility. The wounded cannot crawl out of trenches. Those who could save them cannot reach them. For any modern army, this would trigger a medical emergency. For Russia, it is normalized, like turning a severe accident into routine procedure. Putin does not change his method of warfare. He does not adjust the tempo. He does not pause to reorganize winter logistics. The result is a vicious loop. Soldiers freeze, are wounded, are abandoned, and then die. The survivors are pushed back to the front with less gear, less strength, and fewer chances to live, like running a marathon in a blizzard with a fuel tank steadily draining. Around Pokrovsk, winter does not merely slow the offensive, it drains the vitality of the entire force. When deaths from weather begin to approach deaths from bullets, it signals a far more dangerous phase of warfare: collapse from within. That collapse is visible in what soldiers are equipped with, or not equipped with. As far back as late 2022, CNN documented an embarrassing reality: Russian troops crowdfunding to buy boots, winter clothing, even body armor, items that should have been standard issue. 3 years later, on the Pokrovsk axis, the situation is not better, it is worse. According to the Telegraph, many Russian units, especially along the Lyman direction north of Pokrovsk, are sent into attacks without helmets or body armor. In some cases, only 4 out of 20 squads received helmets. In winter, the lack of a helmet is not just shrapnel risk, it is heat loss through the head, accelerating hypothermia, a small detail, but one that can decide life or death when everything else has already been cut. The Kremlin still tries to project the image of doing something. Russian troops are issued green standing tents, marketed as thermal camouflage gear, a solution that sounds technological but functions like a cheap raincoat in a snowstorm. According to Militarny, these tents provide no warmth, block upward visibility, and make the wearer stand out against snow. A video published by The Sun shows a Russian soldier swearing as the tent proves hard to wear, blown around by wind, and nearly useless, like being issued a parachute without ripcords. Worse, these solutions backfire tactically. The tents obstruct observation while Ukrainian reconnaissance UAVs operate densely overhead. On a battlefield where the sky is a constant threat, blinding yourself is the equivalent of night driving without headlights. Russia appears to believe a thin layer of fabric can fool infrared sensors, but in deep sub-zero cold, thermal masking often works only because there is no heat left to mask. A marketing trick turned survival paradox. Desperation surfaces in even more extreme measures. Defense Express recorded at least one case of Russia using soldiers as living antennas, standing motionless while carrying communications equipment to serve as relay nodes for UAVs in command. In winter, standing still is a death sentence. Yet for Moscow, all individual lives are cheaper than a few minutes of stable signal, like using a person to hold a door shut when the hinge has already broken. These images expose a naked reality. Russia does not merely lack winter equipment, it lacks a force preservation mindset. When an army relies on flimsy tents and living antennas to compensate for collapsing logistics, this is no temporary malfunction. It is a machine running by burning its own people, and winter simply doubles the bill. When soldiers are abandoned to the cold, cracks inevitably climb the command ladder. On the Pokrovsk axis, this has already happened. On January 6th, United 24 Media reported that frontline Russian officer morale had fallen so sharply that many submitted mass requests to leave their posts. Not open desertion, but attempts to be reassigned to rear areas where at least there is shelter, heating, and a chance to survive. Those requests were denied. Russian command responded with threats of discipline and demotion, but the fact that officers, fully aware of the cost of defiance, still signed their names says everything. They no longer believe current orders lead to victory. What they see instead is a conveyor belt of meaningless sacrifice, repeating day and night in sub-zero temperatures, like working in a factory where every safety switch has been removed. Under these conditions, Moscow is forced to replace manpower, but instead of elite units, what arrives at the front increasingly exposes desperation. According to Mediazona, the most common confirmed age range among fatalities is 46 to 52. These are not troops trained for high-intensity winter warfare. It is the signature of an army that has exhausted its resilient layers and is patching gaps with material that no longer stretches. Analysis by the Kiev Post identifies the direct outcome. Daily engagements have dropped by roughly 30%, not because Russia chose de-escalation, but because it can no longer sustain the offensive tempo. Winter does not just freeze the ground, it freezes the command chain, where orders from above no longer carry enough force to push people forward. Like a brake pedal sees solid even as the accelerator stays pressed. In this state, seemingly isolated phenomena link into a single symbol: living antennas. Soldiers standing immobile in thin tents, officers requesting withdrawal. Together they form one picture, a force attacking while disintegrating from within. When soldiers no longer trust their equipment and officers no longer trust their orders, the front line exists only on maps, not in reality. And it is here that General Winter changes sides. In the past, he saved Russia when it defended, but in Ukraine, where Russia is the aggressor, Winter flips roles, becoming Ukraine's ally and Moscow's adversary. Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad do not fall. They become fracture points where offensive ambition freezes alongside the very army ordered to advance. And as long as Winter has not withdrawn, these pressures do not dissipate. They continue to accumulate hour by hour, night by night, in a way that forces the system to pay its price even before the next shot is fired.
Have you ever heard of playing dead? In nature, it's a survival trick used by marsupials. Lie still, stop breathing, let the predator lose interest and move on. In Siversk, Ukraine did the same thing, but with a lethal variation. The animal does not run away after playing dead. It bares its teeth. And right now, it is tearing into the Russian army in the very hunting ground Moscow thought was its own. Russia believed it had taken Siversk. In reality, Ukraine turned Siversk into a snap-shut trap, where every step forward by Putin's forces only tightens the lid. On December 23rd, the BBC reported that Ukraine confirmed the withdrawal of its forces from this frontline town, citing the goal of preserving soldiers' lives and combat capability in the face of Russia's manpower advantage. Moscow read that message as collapse. They applauded, yet they advanced, and they walked straight into the trap. 3.5 years earlier, Russia had pulverized Siversk with artillery and bombs. A small town positioned in front of the steel-hard defensive belt Putin had to breach if he wanted to swallow Donetsk, then the Donbass. Every reinforcement wave was another batch of lives fed into the grinder, worn down by Ukrainian firepower and terrain, one by one, day by day. By October, Russia's third combined arms army, the formation tasked with delivering the decisive blow, had suffered 13,055 casualties in just a few months after taking Toretsk. Siversk became a meat grinder, and Moscow kept shoveling more meat into it, believing that quantity alone would equal victory. The grinder clogged from overload, not from efficiency. Then Russia declared victory. The prey had fallen, the hunter assumed it could stop, breathe, and shift to the next objective. But that is not what happened. Despite its destruction, Siversk was never a hold-at-all-costs city for Ukraine. It was a kill zone. The defenders here removed thousands of Russian soldiers from the fight, turning every ruined street into a blood-soaked equation for the attacker. While the remaining Russian troops celebrated, they failed to realize they had just done exactly what Ukraine needed most. Siversk was no longer a defensive objective. It became a trap, a cheap, efficient, repeatable trap, inflicting greater losses on Putin's forces than any frontal assault ever could. And as Moscow continues to confuse massing troops with making progress, that trap only tightens. Ukraine is now executing a new way of fighting, the very approach that makes what is happening in Siversk possible. That method will be explained shortly. First, we must look squarely at the ground reality of Siversk, where Russia's so-called victory is decomposing by the day. In a detailed breakdown of the situation, New Sky notes that Russia's claimed victory in Siversk is not a victory at all. It is a poisoned chalice. Once consumed, there is no retreat. Ukraine turned the city into a silent trap. No sirens, no exits, only steadily rising losses. The trap works in a very simple and therefore very brutal way. Siversk sits on the axis of the Slavic territories, between Lyman and Lysychansk. More importantly, it blocks the gateway towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, the twin pillars of the Donetsk fortress belt. To swallow Donetsk, then the Donbass, Moscow must pass through these names. On paper, Siversk offers real advantages to an occupier. The city sits on elevated ground, providing broad lines of sight. It is a logistics node, facilitates crossings of the Seversky Donets River, and lies close to arterial routes Russia has long coveted. On the surface, it looks like a perfect prize. The problem is this: high ground is a double-edged blade. At Siversk, elevation only has value if the occupier controls both flanks, and Russia does not. Without flank control, pushing forces uphill is no different than stepping onto a display pedestal, placing your formation squarely inside the enemy's fire envelope. Ukraine did not abandon Siversk out of weakness. It withdrew to open a trap. one pre-positioned for Russian units forced to advance by political pressure. The signs were there early. Ukraine did not turn Siversk into a last-stand city the way it had elsewhere. There were no dense concrete fortifications, no urban stronghold network like Maryenka or Avdiivka, where the city itself became a self-contained defensive bloc. In Siversk, Ukraine did not build walls, they built a script. That script is distinctly American in logic. Let the opponent climb into what they believe is an advantage, then cut the flanks, choke logistics, and grind them down. Russia thought it was standing high to observe. In reality, it was standing high to be seen from every direction. Each new unit pushed onto that high ground was another piece placed onto a square already in check. No brilliant moves required, only time. And that is why Siversk is no longer a city in the traditional sense. It is a killing mechanism, a funnel guiding Russian forces into a zone Ukraine deliberately chose for attrition. As Moscow keeps confusing territorial occupation with survivability, the trap only grows more efficient. With every day, every reinforcement, every new victory report. Ukraine fought here almost to the final second, and withdrew only when every remaining option led to certain death. Normally, withdrawing units fall back one line, reinforce a new defensive position, and then counterattack as Russian forces push forward. Siversk was different. As New Sky explains, Siversk was never meant to be held. It was a component of a larger operational picture. If the enemy advances too deep without protected rear areas and flanks, they are smothered by artillery, UAVs, and interdiction strikes. And that is precisely what Russian forces lacked when they entered Siversk. That lack of protection was no accident. It was the direct result of a layered defense system Ukraine built around Siversk. Russia bombarded the area for years, paying in countless lives, but the real cost only revealed itself at the end. Once attrition began to soak in, Putin's forces collapsed. Communications failed as entire units disappeared. Command posts were repeatedly struck. The final infantry elements that entered Siversk were not conquerors. They were the exhausted, fragmented remnants of a formation that had once been far larger. Russia also shot itself in the foot by the very way it captured Siversk. According to the BBC, the city has been reduced to barely anything resembling an urban environment. Its infrastructure erased by Russian artillery and airstrikes. At the same time, Moscow committed a fatal oversight, failing to seize the surrounding high ground, positions that remain under Ukrainian control and dominate fire into the basin below. As a result, when Russian assault groups flooded into Siversk, they moved straight into an unshielded critical zone, as New Sky describes it. Ukraine activated this zone almost immediately after Siversk was declared fallen. By combining terrain with fire control, the trap revealed itself. Every avenue of approach, especially the Russian supply routes now in use, sat squarely inside the kill envelope of Ukrainian artillery and UAVs. The elevated flanks, still not taken by Russia, have now become firing balconies. From there, Ukraine can strike into Siversk at will. The bitter irony is that the very tactic that allowed Russia to take the city has turned back on its owner. The hunter has changed roles, and Siversk, exactly as designed, continues to consume any force compelled to stand inside the basin. Conditions only worsen for Russia the deeper it pushes into Siversk. The further in they go, the broader the exposed surface becomes. No longer just the forward line, but the rear as well. Ukraine therefore scores 2 targets in a single rhythm, striking the frontline formations while simultaneously cutting the rear. The result is near-daily double kills. Russia does nothing to save itself. Its current approach is as simple as it is reckless. Throw infantry assault groups at the objective, then hope tanks arriving later will solve the rest. Hope, however, is not doctrine, especially not in Siversk. Assault groups cannot advance ahead of Ukrainian UAVs and artillery. According to New Sky, what Russian infantry is doing now is indistinguishable from stepping onto a conveyor belt that leads straight to destruction. Tanks stall as well. Russian crews know exactly what happens the moment they enter Ukrainian UAV range. Reality has already settled the matter. By April 2024, roughly 65% of Russian tanks taken out of action were destroyed by UAVs. Under those conditions, Moscow cannot support assaults in Siversk as long as the flanks remain unresolved, and its failure to secure them before capturing the city was a catastrophic miscalculation. This is not speculation. While Ukraine keeps its most refined moves at Siversk deliberately opaque, open-source intelligence has laid the picture bare. Russia is now trapped in a spiral of systematic strikes against depots, bases, and logistics hubs, many directly tied to the effort to hold Siversk after declaring control. Newsky adds that UAV footage along roads and industrial zones shows Russian assault elements being hit in suicide fashion wherever they attempt to push through. This is real warfare. No fireworks, no slogans, just terrain, tempo, and logistics being severed. None of this is surprising, at least not to those paying close attention. It all traces back to the new strategy Ukraine has engineered, one that allows it to destroy Russian forces even while Moscow believes it has already won. According to Forbes, this strategy was publicly outlined on January 16th. Analyst Vikram Mittal points out that the key lies in calculated tactical withdrawal, exactly the pattern seen in Siversk in December. Ukraine layers its defenses to bleed the attacker. Build the system, open the gate deliberately, then slam the lid shut with firepower. A formula refined over more than 3 years around Siversk and its surrounding terrain, now paying dividends by the day. Beneath the surface of the fighting, Ukraine has stacked multiple layers of lethality around the settlements Russia is desperate to seize. Anti-tank ditches, concrete obstacles, minefields, and dense UAV walls. Together they form what Russian soldiers bluntly call a kill zone, a space designed to drain the attacking force of strength before it ever reaches urban ground like Siversk. The system has only one weakness: physical limits. If Moscow still has enough men to throw into the fire, the layers can eventually be punctured. At present, Russia typically launches assault groups of 50 to 60 soldiers. When the survivors crawl through the forward belt, they are already exhausted, yet still convinced the decisive fight lies ahead, against Ukrainian forces positioned beyond the kill zone. That misplaced confidence is the exact moment Ukraine flips the board. Kiev's method is cold and deliberate. When a Russian thrust collides with a Ukrainian position, the defenders withdraw immediately, yielding ground for a very short window. Then, from prepared flanks and rear positions, UAVs, mortars, and artillery slam back into the very ground just abandoned, where Russian troops are now clustered, fatigued, and exposed. Why? The result is heavy casualties for the new occupiers. That is precisely the rhythm now unfolding in Siversk. In the ideal scenario, the remnants of the force that seized the settlement are compelled to retreat. Ukraine then returns and retakes the ground it had temporarily ceded. This pattern has already appeared in Kupiansk and Kharkiv, where the situation shifted from near collapse to Ukrainian control over most of the area. In Siversk, full liberation remains an open question, but even without raising the flag again, Ukraine can pin Russian forces here for weeks, even months, grinding down every unit forced to enter. If Plan A does not achieve territorial recovery, Plan B is to maximize losses, forcing Russia to pay in blood and metal for every meter of ground it claims to have taken. That price is not abstract. It is cumulative pressure on every subsequent advance launched from Siversk, a bill Moscow will face far sooner than many expect. As Politico noted back in October, the Russian army is bleeding at the pace of a desperate state. In exchange for advances so small, they require a magnifying glass to locate on the map. In just the first 8 months of 2025, Russia lost 281,550 soldiers, including more than 86,700 killed. These are the figures of total war, yet the gains resemble smashing an entire house just to obtain a rusted key. Ukraine's commander-in-chief Oleksandr Syrsky summed up the situation at the time in a single, lethal sentence: the front is difficult, Russia is still attacking, but the overall situation remains under Ukrainian control. In other words, Moscow is flooring the accelerator while the wheels spin uselessly in place.
A Russian politician has just done the most dangerous thing one can do in Moscow. He told the truth. Standing before parliament, this politician openly admitted that Russia cannot win in Ukraine, and that what the Kremlin has been calling a strategic withdrawal is, in reality, nothing more than a humiliating defeat repackaged in the language of propaganda. For that candor, he is now facing prison time for the crime of discrediting the military. But the message has already escaped, and that is what truly terrifies the Kremlin. What makes this statement especially dangerous is not its content, but its source. This is not a pro-Western figure, not a supporter of Ukraine, and certainly not an anti-war activist. On the contrary, he openly despises Ukraine and despises Volodymyr Zelensky. And yet, even with that hostility, he was forced to acknowledge one thing: the math does not work. Russia simply does not have the capacity to win. He stated bluntly that if the war is to end, Russia's parliament must share responsibility with Vladimir Putin for the failure of the so-called special military operation. After more than 4 years, the declared objectives from the denazification of Ukraine to the overthrow of the government in Kyiv have not been achieved, and more importantly, are impossible to achieve in principle. According to his argument, since the summer of 2022, Russia has no longer been fighting Ukraine, but confronting a de facto NATO coalition. More than 80 countries and organizations support Ukraine. Meanwhile, the number of countries aligned with Russia can be counted on one hand. This is not a symmetrical war. It is a war in which the balance was fixed from the very beginning. This statement strikes directly at the core of the narrative the Kremlin has tried to sell to the Russian public for years. Putin has repeatedly claimed that Russia never intended to take Kiev in 2022, that the withdrawal was merely a goodwill gesture, a strategic decision to refocus on eastern Ukraine. But reality does not support that story. Russian tank columns that once stood at the gates of Kyiv were not orderly redeployed. They were destroyed, abandoned, bogged down in mud, becoming physical evidence of a failed campaign. Putin calls it a strategic decision. The rest of the world calls it defeat. Perhaps the Russian language offers a more comfortable word for loss. But the substance does not change. What is particularly striking is that this politician did not limit himself to criticizing tactics or military honor. He went straight to the point the Kremlin fears most: the economy. According to him, every war is ultimately an economic war. And with an economy that accounts for roughly 2% of global GDP, Russia, by definition, cannot defeat a bloc that controls more than 50% of the world economy. Put in terms an American audience would understand. This is like a small company trying to play a cash burn game against the entire S&P 500. You might survive a few quarters, but you cannot win that game. He went on to argue that Ukraine too cannot defeat Russia in the traditional sense. Not because Ukrainian soldiers are weak, but because even the United States and NATO cannot defeat Russia in a conventional war without crossing the nuclear threshold. And if Russia faces an existential defeat, it will escalate to nuclear weapons, a scenario everyone knows produces no winners. His conclusion was cold and entirely immoral. If NATO cannot defeat Russia, and Russia cannot defeat NATO, then prolonging the war only leads to the destruction of lives, resources, and the nation's future. Not for humanitarian reasons, but because the system itself cannot sustain it. He also warned of another consequence that Russian propaganda deliberately ignores: moral decay. When the deaths of hundreds of people each day become routine television content, when killing is normalized through slogans, society begins to slide away from basic legal and ethical norms. War, in this sense, does not merely destroy the enemy's territory, it corrodes the country, waging it from within. And here is the most important point to emphasize. This man did not say the invasion was morally wrong. He did not call for peace, did not invoke international law, did not mention war crimes. He said only one thing, something every strategic planner in Washington understands perfectly well. The Russian economy cannot endure this war. This was not an emotional accusation. It was a financial report read aloud before Parliament, and that is precisely why it truly frightens the Kremlin. Casualties have surpassed sustainable limits, and Russia, by every practical measure, lacks the capacity to win. It is crucial to repeat, this argument does not come from a supporter of Ukraine, nor from a pro-Western opposition figure. It comes from a man who calls Ukraine's elected government neo-Nazi, a man who openly hates Ukraine and Ukrainians. Yet that hatred does not alter the arithmetic he laid on the table. And that arithmetic worsens with every passing month. The longer the war drags on, the more Vladimir Putin grinds the Russian economy into attrition. In 2025, Russia's oil revenue fell by nearly 20%, compared to 2024, a year that was already deeply challenging. Part of this decline stems from lower global oil prices. But the decisive factor is the discount Russia is now forced to accept to sell its oil. In 2025, that discount widened to more than $24 per barrel, nearly double the level seen in the first 2 years of the war. Put bluntly, Russia is paying buyers to take its oil. And even then, the customer list continues to shrink. At this rate, Russian oil will soon cease to be profitable to extract and export at all. The problem is that oil is not just another commodity. It is the backbone of Russia's budget. Lower oil revenue means less money for the military, less money for domestic programs, and less money to sustain the war machine. Sanctions did not knock out Russia in a single blow, but they are steadily tightening the chokehold on its economy over time. Yet economic damage is only the surface layer. The deeper problem is isolation. Russia is becoming increasingly isolated diplomatically and economically, and isolation always carries a price. As this very Russian politician admitted, Moscow's genuine allies can be counted on one hand. The largest of them is China, but ally is not quite the right word. In reality, Russia has slid into a client state role. Moscow depends on Beijing for trade, technology, and diplomatic cover. There is no quick exit. Russia sells oil at a discount and buys Chinese electronics because it can no longer produce them itself. In the language of power, this is not a partnership, it is an asymmetry. The bitter truth is that Russia once had a chance. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 2000s, oil prices surged. That was a rare window to reform the rule of law, open space for small businesses, protect private property, invest in infrastructure, and lay the foundation for a modern economy. But that path was not chosen. Instead, Putin rose to power through war. From Chechnya to the 2008 war with Georgia, and then Ukraine war became a political instrument. When oil prices were high, war was popular. There was money to distribute. Living standards rose, and the illusion of great power status could be sustained. But when oil prices fell, reality came to collect its debt. Russia entered this war with the mindset of a superpower. 3 years later, it faces the risk of becoming a gas station for Beijing. Putin wanted to restore the Soviet Empire. The result is that he is shrinking Russia economically, strategically, and in terms of autonomy. And what happened to the politician who said all of this out loud? Exactly what one would expect in Moscow. He was arrested and charged with discrediting the military, a deliberately vague statute designed to silence anyone who tells the truth. In today's Russia, simply calling the war a war instead of a special military operation can lead to prosecution. Saying that Russia is losing is a crime. Publishing real casualty figures is political suicide. His trial is scheduled for early February. The penalties may include a ban from public office, prison time, and heavy fines. The message to the rest of Russia's elite is unmistakable. Stay silent. Do not say what everyone already knows. Do not point out that the emperor has no clothes. But here is the key point. Putin can arrest a politician, but he cannot arrest the truth. Because this man is no longer a lone voice. More and more voices inside Russia, even if they use more cautious language, are reaching the same conclusion. Even pro-war propagandists, the very people who cheered the invasion for the past 3 years, are now saying that Russia needs to end this war and end it quickly. What is striking is that they still call it victory, yet no one can explain what that victory actually looks like. When even the most ardent supporters begin talking about putting things in the right place and acknowledging the gap between ambition, legality, and reality, that is no longer confidence. It is psychological preparation for an outcome that falls far short of expectations. And that is precisely what the Kremlin fears most. Not criticism from the outside, but the silent consensus forming on the inside. This war cannot be won, cannot be sustained, and the cost now far exceeds any imagined benefit. So what is the core question? Why continue sacrificing Russian and Ukrainian lives for a war that will ultimately turn back against Russia itself? This question is no longer coming from the opposition or anti-war activists. It is being asked by Russian CEOs, Russian business owners, and Russian economists, people who view the world through the lenses of profit, supply chains, and market power. And they're pointing to an uncomfortable truth. The so-called limitless partnership between Russia and China is not a partnership at all. Their argument is blunt. Russia needs China, but China does not need Russia. After the special military operation began, China quickly became Russia's largest economic partner. But that does not mean reciprocity. In reality, in many sectors, including military-related technologies such as drone components, Russia and Ukraine have even been buying from the same suppliers. This does not reflect Russian strength, it reflects dependence and lack of alternatives. Experts on China and emerging markets have been clear. The stories about massive investment and deep financial cooperation are illusions. There is no large capital flow from Beijing to Moscow. There are no strategic loans. And there are certainly no long-term commitments. Everything is constrained by two factors: China's limited real demand for Russian goods and the risk of Western sanctions that Beijing has no intention of absorbing on Russia's behalf. So what is the result? Russia is gradually becoming China's sole seller and simultaneously its sole buyer. A relationship like that is not a partnership, it is dependency. In such a position, Russia has no leverage. Prices are set in Beijing. Payment terms are dictated in Beijing. And if any transaction becomes politically uncomfortable, it is simply halted. The so-called unconditional friendship, therefore, has a very clear condition: as long as it does not cause problems for China. And in reality, over the past 6 months, multiple signs suggest that Beijing has begun to tighten the screws quietly, without announcements, just fewer goods, fewer sensitive components, and more silence in contracts. So what does Russia do next? The door to the European Union, once its largest economic partner, is closed. And even if we assume a peace deal appears tomorrow and sanctions are gradually lifted, the European market will not be waiting for Russia's return. Other suppliers have taken its place. Supply chains have been restructured. In economics, vacuums do not last long, and Russia left that vacuum open for too long. This leads to a cold but unavoidable conclusion. The war is not just making Russia poorer. It is making Russia smaller in economic space, in choice, and in strategic autonomy. Vladimir Putin may have built a system where telling the truth is treated as a crime, but that system cannot change the laws of markets and power. He can arrest people, but he cannot arrest reality, and that reality is advancing quickly. More and more voices inside Russia, even those that once supported the war, are asking the same question, albeit in more circuitous language. What is the real end state of this war? No one can describe what victory looks like anymore, beyond vague slogans about reordering and putting everything in its proper place. When even the most enthusiastic cheerleaders begin talking about the limits of ambition, legality, and objective reality, that is no longer belief. It is psychological preparation for a painful adjustment. And this is the point the West, especially the United States, sees very clearly. Russia is not just fighting Ukraine. Russia is fighting the mathematics of power, the structure of the global economy, and the irreversible consequences of isolation. War can be prolonged through repression and propaganda, but the real balance cannot be arrested, and it is tilting more clearly with each passing month. Everything is unraveling in Russia, but not in the way the Kremlin once feared most. This is not an instant uprising, not a sudden eruption of violence in the streets. It is a slow, deep, and systemic disintegration of the socio-political foundation that has upheld the regime for more than 2 decades. The most dangerous fault line is not in Ukraine's trenches, but in the moment when the cost of war has crossed from abstraction into daily life. As long as war remained an evening news broadcast, society could endure. When it becomes heating bills, fuel prices, food costs, and pensions, silence begins to crack. Russia is experiencing a particularly dangerous form of crisis. A crisis of trust combined with material exhaustion, soaring living costs, a spreading fuel shortage, gas reserves that cannot be distributed efficiently, collapsing public services. Each factor alone would generate discontent. Together, they create social pressure that propaganda cannot neutralize. What is striking is that resistance is no longer confined to traditional opposition groups. For the first time in years, cracks are appearing inside the very layer, designed to sustain regime legitimacy, local government, and lower-level political elites. When city council members in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other key regions publicly call for the supreme leader's resignation. This is no longer peripheral noise. It is an endogenous signal The statement by Grigory Yerv at the Samara Regional Duma is dangerous not because of what was said, but because of who said it. When a deputy, one cog in the machine, openly declares the war a failure and its objectives unattainable, he is not merely challenging policy. He's breaking the code of silence that allows the system to function. The state's reflex arrest charges of discrediting the military only confirms one thing: the regime understands the threat posed by truth spoken from within. But this is not a spontaneous moment. It is the resurfacing of assessments long suppressed. For years, Russia's military and diplomatic will function like two gears on the same shaft, automatically legitimizing every decision from the Kremlin. Now both gears are slipping, not for lack of orders, but for lack of capability and lack of any factual basis to keep pretending. Statements from former commanders such as Vladimir Churkin show that the collapse has moved beyond ordinary political debate. When a seasoned military figure admits Russia was unprepared for war, points to systemic intelligence failure, and exposes flawed assumptions made before the first shot was fired, this is an admission of structural failure, not tactical error. The Smolensky District Council in St. Petersburg formally submitting a petition to remove the president on charges of treason is an extreme symbolic act, but a calculated one. They harbor no illusions about legal outcomes. Their goal is to break the final taboo, naming defeat using the language of the very constitution the regime claims to uphold. Once the concept of treason is inverted and aimed back at the center of power, legitimacy ceases to be automatic. Parallel to political fracture is a social crisis far deeper and more corrosive. Fuel shortages do not merely hinder movement, they shatter daily rhythm heating, schooling, work, medical access. For the elderly, the regime's most loyal pillar, this is a decisive blow. Cutting social funds to offset war deficits, sharply reducing real pensions and delaying payments, has broken an already fragile social contract weakened since the 2018 pension reform. When the state begins taxing every meal through VAT increases, this is no longer budget adjustment. It is the transfer of war costs from the center of power to society at large. At that point, war ceases to be a state choice. It becomes a coerced burden placed on every citizen. The Kremlin's greatest danger is not protest, but the convergence of three forces: material exhaustion, loss of trust, and the erosion of tacit elite consensus. When these converge, history shows collapse requires no dramatic trigger. It only needs time. Even before the first shot was fired, Leonid Ivashov saw the outcome, not on an operational map, but in the structure of Russia's military itself. When a retired general publicly calls on the president to resign before war begins, this is not politics. It is a technical warning. The system lacks the capacity to withstand the conflict it is entering. Everything that followed merely confirmed it. Dozens of city council members in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Samara did not coordinate a rebellion. They simply recognized the same reality. The state is demanding society pay for a war the apparatus itself knew could not be won. Instead of adjustment, the Kremlin chose denial. Putin declared the war would continue not because conditions allowed it, but because no political exit remained. While rhetoric in Moscow remains unchanged, reality at the front has shifted completely. This is no longer unit-to-unit combat, but an industrialized environment of destruction. FPV drones, real-time sensors, and Ukraine's precision fires have turned the front line into a continuous human grinder. European intelligence assessments indicate Russian monthly casualties have exceeded sustainable replacement thresholds. This is no longer a military problem. It is a biological and demographic one. The Kremlin understands this, and that is why it fears mass mobilization more than battlefield defeat. A formal draft would shatter the last shell of social stability. Instead, it resorts to patchwork solutions, contract soldiers from impoverished regions, disguised volunteers, mercenaries redefined through legal language. But an army built on desperation cannot endure. The consequences ripple back into society at a speed that cannot be concealed. Regions like Samara need no battlefield reports to understand what is happening. They see it in the unbroken chain of funerals. Each new grave is silent proof of warnings once mocked. When Alexander Shokin speaks about VAT, this is not economic debate. It is confirmation that the 2026 budget is effectively a civilian sacrifice budget designed to sustain war. When Medvedev openly labels it a wartime budget, the state inadvertently admits the core truth. Every surplus ruble will bypass hospitals, schools, and infrastructure and flow straight to the front. And when social gaps cannot be filled by growth, the state has only one tool left: deeper taxation of the present. Russian youth see this more clearly than any other group. They oppose not out of idealism, but survival math. The 81% opposing new mobilization do so not because they love peace, but because they understand this war has no endpoint. The exodus of more than 700,000 young people since 2022 was not flight. It was a conscious withdrawal from a social contract unilaterally broken. Fearing social backlash, the Kremlin launched a second, more dangerous mobilization, covert and corrosive, under the guise of volunteerism. The state targets the most vulnerable: the poor, debtors, prisoners. Promises of high pay and freedom are not incentives. They are instruments of coercion. This does not merely degrade military quality. It destroys any remaining trust young generations have in a future tied to the Russian state. At the front, casualty figures have crossed the symbolic threshold. With total Russian killed and wounded estimated to exceed 1 million, the issue is no longer replacement. No modern society can regenerate a lost generation through forced drafts. Poorly trained, ill-equipped soldiers with no reason to fight only accelerate collapse. They do not reverse it. And perhaps the heaviest blow is coming from those who were once the regime's most loyal foundation: mothers. When sons do not return, when pensions are cut, when the state is left with nothing but hollow words, loyalty turns into silent rage. The image of a mother arrested simply for holding a placard showing her son's enlistment date is not an isolated incident. It is a symbol of double betrayal: the betrayal of blood and the betrayal of trust. At this point, Putin is no longer facing a protest movement. He is facing a society that is no longer willing to sacrifice more, not for victory, not for honor, and not for promises that have lost all value. The intergenerational betrayal unfolding in Russia is no longer a matter of social psychology. It has become a new force of political dynamics, seeping into every corner of the federal system and beginning to distort how power operates from within. When protests no longer revolve around abstract political slogans, but around raw survival needs: unpaid pensions, heating systems collapsing in winter, shortages of medicine, and children dying on the battlefield, the regime has entered a far more dangerous phase. One in which the state is questioned not over legitimacy, but over its capacity to exist. In small and mid-sized cities outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, bread and water protests pose a greater threat than any organized opposition movement. This is where propaganda loses all traction. When people have no money for food, no fuel for heating, and no medicine for the elderly, every message about national glory becomes meaningless. It is here that Russia's federal structure begins to feel real pressure. Regions grow increasingly reluctant to carry out orders from the center, not out of separatist ideology, but because they simply lack the resources to absorb additional war costs. Governors and mayors are trapped between two irreconcilable forces: directives from Moscow and the increasingly open anger of local populations. As the cost of war continues to rise, new taxes imposed by the Kremlin to patch budget holes and pension systems do not stabilize the situation, they amplify it. Each tax increase pushes more citizens into a state of passive confrontation. Running parallel is the risk of a new wave of emigration. Those who could not leave after the first mobilization, or who believed there would be no second wave, are now seeking every possible route out, not only out of fear of war, but because the economy and society are tightening around them day by day. Russia is not only losing soldiers, it is losing its future labor force, its intellectual capital, and its demographic structure assets that cannot be recreated by administrative decree. Against this backdrop, the question is no longer whether Vladimir Putin wants to stop this trajectory, but whether he still has the tools to control it. Over 25 years in power, Putin built a familiar crisis management toolkit: repression, propaganda, and co-optation. The first reflex is always the iron fist. Anyone daring to utter the word resignation, from city councils to soldiers' mothers, faces direct repression. But this time, isolated repression is no longer enough. The most likely scenario is a broad crackdown aimed at rebuilding a wall of fear. granting expanded powers to the FSB and Rosguardia, and criminalizing every seed of dissent before it can take shape. The problem is this: fear only works when daily life remains bearable. Meanwhile, Russia's interior is genuinely burning. Refineries and military facilities are being struck in succession. Power and water outages have become routine. Urban services are collapsing. Snow clearing capacity is overwhelmed, and citizens are forced to push multi-ton trucks out of snow with their own hands in desperation. And at the same time, the atmosphere in Moscow is detached from reality to the point of absurdity. This disconnect is most clearly exposed through the language of the ruling elite. Dmitry Medvedev remains trapped in World War II obsessions, portraying the current war as a continuation of the Great Patriotic War, in which the Ukrainian state does not exist, only the unfinished business of 1945. Extreme propagandists go even further, dreaming of Russian flags over Berlin, speaking of marching or flying there while sprinkling in nuclear blackmail. This is not strategy, it is a symptom, a machine unable to advance a few kilometers on the front line. Yet, speaking of Berlin reveals one thing only: decision makers have completely abandoned logic. The source of this illusion lies in a chronic disease of the Russian military, a culture of lying. The statement by Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov claiming the liberation of Kupiansk is a textbook example. When independent maps from Blackbird and the Institute for the Study of War show Russian forces still at least 10 kilometers away, the lie collapses. More tellingly, even pro-Russian Z channels could not swallow the story. When propaganda begins to be mocked within its own camp, the system has entered a phase of self-erosion. This culture of embellishment not only distorts leadership perception, it severs the real chain of command. Reports sent to the Kremlin reflect not the battlefield, but the desires of those receiving them. In such an environment, dreams of Berlin are not individual madness. They are the logical product of a system that has lost the ability to distinguish reality from fiction. Viewed as a whole, Russia is not merely facing a military or economic crisis. It is entering a cycle of self-destruction, with the price being the accumulated consequences of lies. The social contract Putin constructed, stability in exchange for obedience, has been broken from both sides. Stability is gone, while demands for obedience remain intact. And it is precisely this dissonance that is creating a condition more dangerous than any protest. A society that no longer believes, yet does not know where it will ultimately stand.
Russia today no longer echoes with military marches from victory parades. What now reverberates through its major cities is the heavy, synchronized footfall of angry crowds, not from the Ukrainian front, but from within Russia itself. Banks are empty, millions of credit cards are suddenly blocked, salaries vanish, accounts are frozen, and most importantly, the silence that defined Russian society for years has ended. Russian youth, the generation once promised stability and prosperity, are now openly venting their anger on social media, despite the risks. Russians are being systematically stripped of everything, not just money, but the ability to exist in the 21st century. With interest rates at suffocating levels, millions of young people cannot service debt, cannot buy homes, cannot start families. What were once considered basic standards, a roof over one's head, a reasonable loan, a future that could be planned, have become luxuries. For them, the word future no longer means advancement or accumulation. It resembles a medieval migration, abandoning cities, abandoning dreams, searching for survival. Russia is sinking into the largest mortgage crisis in its modern history. From Moscow to St. Petersburg, public space is dominated not by patriotism, but by fear. People rush to withdraw cash from banks, a primal reflex when trust collapses. While Vladimir Putin continues sending soldiers to the front in pursuit of imperial dreams, those left behind are exploited by state-protected construction conglomerates. Crony developers collect payments, abandon projects, and then leave behind dead concrete shells, tombstones of a shattered social contract. Wives of soldiers at the front have no homes to live in. Veterans return buried in debt, unpaid for months, forced to cover medical costs themselves. From Kursk to Rostov, the same cry echoes. Where is our money? This is not a political question. It is a survival question. The anger that overthrew the Tsar in 1917 never disappeared. It merely hibernated. And in 2026, it is awakening. What is striking is that these cries are not coming from Kyiv. They are rising from Crimea, from Rostov, from the very regions the Kremlin claims have been stabilized. While Putin speaks of a greater Russia, people realize they have been left with bottomless financial pits. In Kursk, around 200 civilians, homeless, indebted, and evicted, gathered in front of the Sujansky District Administration building. This is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of structural collapse. To grasp the scale of today's devastation, one must remember what has vanished. Go back just 5 years. After the chaos of the 1990s, oil-rich Russia entered what many called the post-Soviet golden period. According to Rosstat, by 2021, 92% of Russians owned their own homes, a higher rate than in the United States or Germany. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, people discussed vacations, new cars, home renovations. Not how to survive the month. Real incomes rose more than 160% since the early 2000s. Banks competed to issue loans. Interest rates remained manageable. Home ownership was not a privilege, it was the norm. This was Putin's social contract. You stay out of politics. I guarantee prosperity and security. And for a long time, that contract worked, until the morning of February 24th. When tanks crossed into Ukraine, it wasn't just international law that was torn apart. The prosperity Russians had built over more than 3 decades was thrown into the fire. Overnight, the concept of normal life vanished. The middle class, the pillar of social stability, is dissolving in bank withdrawal lines. The dream of home ownership has been replaced by debt servitude. To understand today's collapse, one must confront the cost that was sacrificed. Russia traded its children's future for an outdated imperial fantasy. And this is the ignition point.
Unnoticed. Number 1, they want to spend 40% on the military, police and FSB in 2026, and that is the largest increase since the Soviet.
What is unfolding in Russia is not a financial fluctuation. It is the moment the system's spine begins to snap. Data from 2025 to 2026 paints a consistent picture. Russia is grappling with the largest mortgage crisis since the early 2000s. Not as a wave, but as a tsunami. In just 1 year, overdue mortgage debt surged 76.6%. This is not a bad number in a report. This is systemic fracture. Total non-performing loans have reached 276 billion rubles, with 115 billion rubles added in just 12 months. Capital evaporation that no propaganda can hide. When money disappears from balance sheets, liquidity freezes. And when liquidity freezes, credit taps are shut. To what extent? To the point that the central bank, despite slogans that everything is fine, has quietly begged commercial banks to restructure loans, are extending the process into mid-2026. They may call it prevention. Anyone who understands finance calls it what it is: delayed bankruptcy. The unfinished construction sites seen at the beginning are not isolated accidents. They are symbols of organized decay. Soldiers' wives invested in state-backed projects, marketed as safe, while their husbands were at the front. Money was collected. Foundations were poured. Then the company vanished. Concrete skeletons stand as silent confessions of regulatory collapse. In Crimea and Rostov, abandoned projects reveal not only contractor flight, but the power vacuum created by a wartime economy. Where does this audacity come from? From chaos? From suspended law? From a system that channels all energy into the military-industrial complex while letting the civilian economy suffocate? Real inflation far exceeds official figures. Construction costs have skyrocketed. Completing projects is no longer profitable. So the easy option is activated. Take the money and run. Earlier warnings about economic difficulties are no longer knocking at the door. They are sitting in Russian kitchens. Real incomes fall. Living costs explode. People borrow simply to survive. They stand in hours-long lines to buy eggs, an image that does not belong to a superpower. But those lines exist only for those who still have purchasing power. Income used to service debt is being crushed by wartime inflation. The result is unmistakable. Russia's middle class is being systematically destroyed. Homeowners who once took pride in ownership are now an abandoned army of debtors left to the banks. When the housing market collapses, it does not stop at bricks and mortar. It spreads like a toxin through the financial bloodstream, ultimately paralyzing the entire body. That exact domino effect is now unfolding, i.e. warnings from Ukraine about artificial stability have proven correct. Today, even institutions close to power can no longer deny it. A macroeconomic analysis report confirms the real banking crisis has begun. Non-performing loans have crossed the red threshold of 10%, and in several critical sectors reached 19%. In plain terms, 1 out of every 5 loans is not being repaid. For banks, this is a liquidity death sentence. The system is now breathing only thanks to injections from the National Welfare Fund, the last reserves from oil revenues. But reserves are not infinite, and the burn rate is terrifying. For ordinary citizens, the system has already collapsed. In the first weeks of 2026, Russian banks simultaneously blocked 2 to 3 million cards and accounts, an unprecedented panic move, 10 times the normal monthly average. This was the clearest signal yet. Banks were protecting themselves by holding on to customers' money. Images spread everywhere. Cards declined at market stalls, drivers stranded at gas stations, pensioners unable to withdraw salaries. When they crowded into bank branches, the answer was always the same. Go to the central bank. That was not deflection. It was an admission of helplessness. Bank branches turned into gathering points of rage. The most haunting question erupted. Is my money safe? When trust evaporates, bank runs become inevitable. And the final outcome of this chain is a historic wave of bankruptcies. According to 2025 data, more than 500,000 Russians have formally declared bankruptcy, up 31% year on year. The critical detail, 97% filed voluntarily. This is the white flag of finance. I'm done. Industrial centers, once symbols of pride, have become bankruptcy capitals. In places considered the heart of the war production economy, workers can no longer service their debts. Productivity and loyalty cannot survive on a foundation of despair. Society stops planning. It merely tries to get through the day. As cards are blocked, people shift to cash, swelling the black market. Demand for cash, a weakening ruble, and inflation combine into a downward spiral. And here lies the central question. Why has the state pushed its people to this edge? Because this is not incompetence. This is a choice. When viewed in full, the answer becomes uncomfortable but clear. What is happening is not an accident. It is a policy decision. The Kremlin has turned scarcity into a tool, and that tool is designed to serve war. As concrete supplies dry up, housing projects grind to a halt. From Moscow to satellite cities, construction sites turn into ghost towns. Wind blows through rusting steel frames like through a museum of broken promises. This construction crisis is not just about contractors. Construction is a core engine of the Russian economy, pulling hundreds of auxiliary industries: steel, glass, interiors, transport. When the engine derails, the cars behind it overturn in sequence. Unemployment rises in the real economy, even as statistics attempt to mask it. And it is here that independent economists' analyses become chilling in their cold logic. This is not a mistake. This is a trap. Call it by its proper name: poverty weaponized. People fall into despair, take small loans just to survive, then become trapped in inescapable debt. For the state, this creates a brutal advantage. A debtor is easier to mobilize. When accounts are frozen, when mortgages collapse, when bankruptcy lists appear, only one door remains open: the military recruitment office. Data reinforces this argument. More than 568,000 Russians have defaulted on mortgages, had accounts frozen, and were forced into bankruptcy. As the civilian economy collapses, the state offers contract signing bonuses to join the military, reaching 2 to 3 million rubles in some regions. In other words, the economic crisis has been restructured into a recruitment mechanism. But this strategy contains one variable the Kremlin cannot control: Russia's youth. With average wages of 50,000 to 60,000 rubles, interest rates at 21%, and real inflation far exceeding official figures, the equation is impossible. Home ownership, once the norm, has been erased from the calculation. The future of young people has been confiscated, and unlike previous generations, they are not silent. They do not accept the Soviet model. Social media, Telegram channels, and underground forums boil with anger over low wages, war, and homelessness. Young Russians understand that the promised Great Russia is in reality a system that strips them of homes, buries them in debt, and ultimately sends them to die at the front. This awareness is the Kremlin's greatest fear, because a generation with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than any weapon. So is there an exit? The short and brutal answer is no. The door back has been locked. This is not a cyclical crisis. It is structural collapse. The economic DNA has been altered to serve war. And because the money shortage cannot be solved, the Kremlin has only its final cards left. First, the gradual elimination of cash and forced transition to a digital ruble. I do not call this modernization, it is a shackle. The state can track every transaction. One anti-war post, one protest by soldiers' wives, and a digital wallet can be frozen with a single click. Second, using deprivation as a tool of submission. When anger threatens the Kremlin's walls, a scapegoat is required. The list is ready. Bankers, construction tycoons, economic officials, big names can be arrested, branded traitors, or Western agents. The goal is to redirect rage, not to solve its cause. Third, intensified propaganda and surface-level appeasement. But no propaganda can drown out the sound of an empty refrigerator. Young people know their future has been stolen. Soldiers' families know they have been deceived. Russian history is remarkably consistent. Revolutions do not begin in palaces, they begin in breadlines. When 1917 followed this pattern, 1991 did as well. And in 2026, under the dim lights of mortgaged apartments and abandoned construction sites, the third great rupture is approaching. The war is no longer confined to Ukraine's fields. It has entered kitchens, banks, and daily life inside Russia. On this front, Vladimir Putin has no chance of victory. Russia's future has been mortgaged, and the bailiff is already at the door.